Welcome everyone to a new part of the channel. So I've been doing a lot of videos lately on previous Nobel Prizes. I sort of started at the earliest ones and I've been working to the more recent ones. And kind of trying to relate them to every people's everyday lives and explain why they're important, because sometimes the titles of those things are really difficult to understand. But one of the reasons I've been doing that is, as a scientist myself, I realized that there were certain things when I was younger sort of drew me to the field. And it realized it really hasn't had a chance for people to understand who it is and why I've kind of who I am and why I've gone on this mission to kind of maybe bring these things out a little bit more than they have been. Well, hi. um, Tim Imholt. I do have a PhD in experimental physics. I've got 20 plus years in industry and academia, depending on how you slice it. I've always had a kind of a foot in both worlds, except recently I haven't been too much involved in academia. I've been more involved in industry. But the projects I've been on have been anything from nanostructured materials to ballistic materials to helping try to figure out how to prevent traumatic brain injuries in soldiers during the war on terror, and including people like at the NFL level. I've worked on things in sensor technology for the nuclear world, the non-nuclear world. Worked on reactions in the nuclear space. Pick it, I've probably done something in it somewhere across 2 decades. Most of my more recent work is in this field called artificial intelligence, not generative AI. That's a whole different field. I work in predictive analytics, which is a big fancy way of saying take a really messy data set and try to figure out where it's going to go. But that's not the point to this new program. So this new aspect to the channel, as I started talking about science more and more in the public eye, I realized there's a lot of misconceptions. There's a lot of hatred, I think. Not hatred is probably the wrong word, but misunderstanding that goes on in between the scientific community and everyone else. And not sure whose fault that is, other than it, just sort of one of those things that just occurred and while we all weren't paying attention. But it certainly wasn't true 40 years ago. I'm 52. I'm not that old, so 40 years ago does matter. I was 12. But the point is, when I was a kid, there were two people who were on educational programming quite often that I really enjoyed watching with my dad. One of those was a guy named James Burke, who ran a show called Connections. He was a science historian who would find a device and say, "Oh, look, in the modern world, you really care about this. Now let's show you where it came from." And he'd like rewind all the way back to like Henry VIII and show you how it kind of evolved over 200 years to get to the widget that you know and love today. Another one of those was Carl Sagan. Carl was an astrophysicist, and he was sort of like the scientific community's version of Mr. Rogers. He could kind of explain very complicated subjects to people and have it make sense. And he's passed away now, but there were a couple of things that it came out of one of his books that I wanted to share as we go on this sort of understanding science journey. And the Nobel Prize videos will continue, but I'm also going to do at least once or twice a week, I'm going to do a video about more modern science and what's going on and trying to explain even the controversial topics in a way that I think can be relevant and understandable. Because one of the big things I hear from people all the time is, oh, scientists only care about who's funding them. Well, scientists do need funding, that's true. I feel, oh, they'll just report whatever those funding agencies say, and that's not true. There are some scientists I'm sure that's true for, but the ones I've known over the years, they by and large, what the funding agency wants from them, they don't really care. Um, and that's I think a sign of a very good scientist. So let me read from Carl Sagan's book a couple of paragraphs. I don't want to read the whole book. I think if you're interested in it, it's called "The Demon Haunted World." He wrote it in the 90s. But there's a couple of passages in it that absolutely are relevant to why this part of this channel is going to exist. And let's read from Carl's words. So science thrives on errors, cutting them away one by one. False conclusions are drawn all the time, but they are drawn tentatively. Hypotheses are framed so that they are capable of being disproved. That's important. A succession of alternate hypotheses is confronted by experimentation and observation. Science gropes and staggers towards improved understanding. That matters. Improved understanding is what we're here for. Back to Carl's words. Proprietary feelings are, of course, offended when a scientific hypothesis is disproved, but such disproofs are recognized as central to the scientific enterprise. Just because a scientist comes up and says something today doesn't mean in 2 years he's going to come up and say something different because he's got new evidence that points him in another direction. Because remember, there was a time just like 150 years ago where people weren't really sure, whether the atom had smaller things inside it or not, or whether it was the smallest thing you had. And now we know inside the atom there's all kinds of crap. But let's get back to Carl. Now, so remember, such disproofs are recognized as central to the scientific enterprise. Now, let's go into pseudoscience, see what Carl has to say. Pseudoscience is exactly the opposite. Hypotheses are often framed precisely so they are invulnerable to any experiment that offers a prospect of disproof. So even in principle, they cannot be invalidated. Think about that. Back to Carl. Practitioners are defensive and wary. Skeptical scrutiny is opposed. When pseudoscientific hypothesis fails to catch fire with scientists, conspiracies to suppress it are deduced. So, oh, scientists don't agree with me. It's a conspiracy. They're hiding the truth from us all, right? That must be what it is. So, skip a couple paragraphs, but Carl brings up something else important. If we teach only the findings and products of science, no matter how useful and even inspiring they may be, without communicating the critical method, how can the average person possibly distinguish science from pseudoscience? And that's why this channel is going to exist, is so that I can explain not just the answer, but how the answer became the answer and why that answer matters to your daily life. Because so far, especially in some of the Nobel Prize videos I've done, I think I've gotten some interesting comments from people like, "Oh, I thought Einstein won for the theory of relativity." Well, no, he won for the photoelectric effect, which, by the way, is the thing that makes solar cells and CCD cameras work, right? So, those are important things for us to understand, at least in modern world. Um, so he won the prize for something other than what people think he did, but it's because of that prize that CCD camera right there and the one on your phone and the LED and all that other stuff actually work is because of that photoelectric effect. At its base. I mean, there's a lot of engineering that goes around it, but its base principle is that. So that's why this new part of this channel is going to exist, is to try to take and peel back that onion and show it to people in a way that matters. And I'm going to try to keep the math out of it. Sometimes math will pop up, but the math will try to keep it as simple as we can. And I'll try to keep it in the form of charts because nobody wants to look at calculus. Nobody wants to look at differential equations. Okay, some people do. And if you do, give me a call. I'm happy to do it with you offline, but we're not going to do it on the channel. So now I do want to read one other thing that Carl brought up because he saw a, a sort of shift in the way we were thinking around the world, or at least in the United States. And most of his book and writing is about the United States. He does speak about the world, but most of this particular book is showing anecdotes from the United States because this is where he lived. But at this point in time when he wrote this book, something like 10% of the population was shown to be scientifically literate, and that's bad. 90% are scientifically illiterate. And now we've got a society that's sort of 20% scientifically literate. So we're doing better, but we need improvement. Now, let's look at something Carl brought it forward to my attention that I didn't know. And this was a press release by a political party, and I'm not going to say which one until the end, but it was a press release from a political party on December 5th, 1994. And no, I am not going to tell you which party until the end, so you'll have to bear with me. And I know 1/3 of everybody watching will be saying, "Oh, it was my group." And the other group, 1/3 will be saying, "Oh, it was mine." And 1/3 will be like, "Who the heck was that?" That makes too much sense. Okay. Public education. Here's the joint proclamation made. Public education in science has been withering in recent years. At the same time, activities of superstition and ignorance have been growing, and anti-science and pseudoscience cases have become frequent. Therefore, effective measures must be applied as soon as possible to strengthen public education in science. The level of public education in science and technology is an important sign of the national accomplishment. It is a matter of overall importance in economic development, scientific advance, and progress of society. Now, those are pretty interesting words. Now, let's look at who wrote that. Let's finish this whole paragraph. It's just one paragraph. We must be attentive and implement such public education as a part of strategy to modernize our socialist country to make our nation powerful and prosperous. Ignorance is never socialist, nor is poverty. That was a press release from China and the Chinese Communist Party on December 5th, 1994. Now think about this for a second. In the United States, we have a growing problem with pseudoscience kind of becoming the mainstream. We have a growing problem of scientists being shouted down and told they're wrong and to do their homework because some influencer on social media, and I get the irony to that, some influencer on social media or some podcaster said, well, this is true. And if you can't prove me wrong, it must be right. It's not how science works. We just read Carl's explanation of how science works. You don't get to make a statement and say, oh, prove me wrong. And if you can't prove me wrong, I'm right. That's not it. You have to prove your statement correct. That's the scientific process. I'm going to make a statement. I'm going to go in the lab and work my butt off to try to make sure I can prove it to you. Well, those things matter. Proof matters. Proof is in the pudding, as they say. So this part of this channel is going to be a once or twice a week drop where we start to look at more modern things, and certain topics may extend over several videos, but I'm going to try to peel back that scientific onion to explain why certain things are certain ways. And I'm not going to shy away from topics that are politically controversial. So yes, we will talk about the greenhouse effect. We will talk about COVID vaccines because apparently that one still is sticking in people's heads. And we will talk about string theory, dark matter, a whole bunch of things, gravity waves, whatever happens to be popping up that week. And the other thing I will make a great effort to do, because a lot of people seem to believe the contrary, is I will take great pains to find articles that produce results that were contrary to what the agency funding that result wanted to see, and those things still get published. So I don't think people realize that actually it does occur. And yes, I'm not convinced that you will find scientists out there that are looking for a certain answer and go, haha, I found it. And maybe they try to ignore certain things. I'm not saying that doesn't occur, but the opposite does occur also, where a funding agency was after a certain answer and they didn't get it and it got published anyway, and the scientist is still working away on something else now. So let's take this journey together, and I do hope everybody joins in for the long haul. This is going to be fun. If you have a particular topic you'd love to see talk about from modern physics, I don't want to go all the way back to Tomley and all that kind of fun stuff. That's on the other part of the channel. But this will be its own playlist. So stay tuned. It's all coming up, but we're going to try to differentiate science from pseudoscience. We're going to do it together. It's going to be a lot of fun. Everybody enjoy your day.